Hi, this is Sandy Colby, and this is my YouTube presentation on my senior thesis paper. So my paper for this class is set in the period of time called the early national period. So we're looking at the late 1700s through about 1840. It's going to include some information on the War of the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and into the early antebellum period. It's going to be kind of spread all over geographically. We're going to be looking at the narratives of men who lived in Virginia, Pennsylvania. Some of them are down south in New Orleans, Georgia, North Carolina. It's going to be kind of spread all over. We're looking at different the narratives of several men and follow their path that they recorded in their narratives. So time and place. And the theme of the paper is how different experiences and different institutions, I guess that they dealt with, influenced the creation of identity. And this isn't a national identity. It's specifically related to the African origin peoples who were brought to the country or born in the country, the U.S. And I'm looking at both free blacks and enslaved people. The 7 main narratives that I'm focusing on, my primary sources, are Reverend Richard Allen, Reverend Thomas H. Jones, Lunsford Lane, Austin Stewart, Moses Grandy, Charles Ball, and James Roberts. These were all narratives that were written or co-written after they had escaped their bondage, and the majority of them were used as as abolitionist documents to promote the abolitionist movement. A lot of them were written later, like the 40s and 50s and 60s, building up to the Civil War. I'm also going to be using the Confession of Nat Turner from the Turner Rebellion. I'm going to be using the civil case documents of a man named Basile Francois Dede. He was a free black man who was a bricklayer, and he had rented a horse and carriage and entered in business agreements, and he was being taken to court for not following the rules of the contracts and for counterfeiting and stuff like that. I'm also going to be looking at war documents related to the contributions of the black soldiers that had enlisted. So I'll be looking at some naval documents that talk about how the sailors that were enlisted were really good soldiers. I'm also going to be looking at General Jackson's announcement that they were going to go ahead and let the black people in the area, both freed and later the slaves in the area, join the fight in New Orleans. The secondary sources that I'm using cover kind of a range. So I've got some that look at identities of people of African origins and how they change from the early, like the colonial period through the antebellum period. A couple other books that I'm using, secondary sources I'm using, are biographies of some of the men. Those are going to give a little more in-depth information about their lives outside of the narratives that I have. I have a couple books that look at maritime jobs that really help shape the identities of the people that were working in them. So there were seamen's rights, and even if it was a person of African origins that was working, he had the same rights as all the other sailors. And that's whether it was a civilian job or a military job. They were kind of protected either way. It also gave them a chance to earn money and gave them a chance to communicate with other people um, and help build their communities. And it really changed a lot of things in their identity. I've also got one book called The Slave's Gamble that was really good, and that talks about how the people of African origins had an opportunity to choose who they wanted to fight with during the War of 1812. A lot of the northern blacks and the business owners in New Orleans, they fought with the U.S. side because they wanted to either prove their loyalty or protect their businesses and their status. And then slaves that enlisted on the side of the U.S. were often promised their freedom, even though it didn't usually happen afterwards. The other choices that the men had was they could join the British, either as military men helping fight against the U.S., or they could go as civilians, and they were transported to other places within the British Empire where they could set up new lives as free people. For the people in the Southeast, there was another option. They could go into Spanish-held Florida, and if they went there, they could either join the Seminoles that were down there, or they could just integrate into the Spanish population. One of the interesting things about the men who went to Florida is that a lot of times they were leaving the U.S. so they could escape being enslaved, and when they got there, they would set themselves up on a big plantation, and then they would purchase slaves to work the land for them. That was one of the interesting things that I found in that book. So historical questions. When I first started this project, I wasn't sure where I was going to go with it. I just kind of wanted to see. At first, it was just about the African American contribution to the war effort, and there were a few instances, and then I started to read the narratives, and there were a lot of really important overlapping areas in the narratives that kind of drew me into talking more about the identity. One of the main themes that appears in most of these narratives is the theme of religion, and religion had a transformative effect on the slaves and the freemen, but the slaves in particular had made a lot of changes in their lives and afterwards based on their newfound faith. Another big influence that I came across was the ability to earn money and having the power to spend it how they wanted. That was another important theme. Most of the men in this study that I'm doing, they were enslaved at one point. Usually they were born into slavery, and then they were either had the opportunity to earn money to buy their freedom later, or they were able to buy their freedom under somebody else's name. So sometimes, in one particular instance, he wasn't allowed to buy himself. He had to have a white man buy him, and then they had to go out of state so he could finally actually be free. Another man was never legally free, but he ran away and he earned his freedom that way, went up north. So there's a lot of different circumstances. The war effort and how they participated in the war, it was another identity shaping event for a lot of them. Some of them were too old or too young and didn't participate in the War of 1812, but it was a similar sentiment that they felt in the war the American Revolution, and then the ones that were too old, they didn't have a lot of war experience, um, so that I won't mention them too much. And then the last big influence that I noticed, a reoccurring theme, was that they had loyalty to different areas. So some people had a loyalty to their African heritage and their home country, and others had loyalty to the United States. Some loyalties went deeper than that, so we had some that were loyal to their specific region or their specific state, so the North or South or specific state. Um, and so those are the four main things that I saw overlapping these narratives, and they were big events or a big deal in their life, and it really changed who they were, from something as basic as their status of a free person or an enslaved person to how they felt about themselves, how they presented themselves to other people, that type of stuff. So my conclusion is that these four elements that contributed to the shaping of their identities were all really important because they seem to provide the men with some type of agency in different ways. So the religious aspect, they read the Bible and they had a big conversion and they changed their lives based on that. A lot of them got a little bit more freedom of where they could go. They could travel to other plantations to preach, and so they had a little more freedom. They made some other changes in their lives. The money definitely changed their life because they could they could purchase their freedom. They could become business owners. They could purchase a home. That's a big deal. And then they had the chance to spend the money how they wanted. They didn't have to turn it over to someone else, which was a big deal too. The war experience as well. They had choices about who they were going to fight with, why they were going to fight. So that provided some agency. And then their loyalty, that one may not have as much agency, but they felt more, in general, they felt more loyal to regions that did offer them, I guess, more agency. So there was more loyalty to the North than the South, or to home cities that they were raised in that offered them more opportunities. One of the men was born and lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, and as soon as he got his freedom, he was sent a note saying that now that he was free, it was illegal for him to live in the state, and so he had to move out of state so he wasn't arrested. So even though he was born and raised there, that's not where his heart was once he moved and found a place that was more accommodating, that accepted him better. So that's my conclusion, that these four particular things were really important in the formation of identity because they were the ones that provided a lot of agency to the people that we're talking about. So that is all, I think. So thank you, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.